We're going to be looking at Britain and the British attempt at democracy and the implications within the British Islands today. So, a couple of things before we get started, right? The 18th century for Britain is one that has a massive change within it. And the massive change is that England and Scotland, which had been united under one crown for about 100 years, finally unites in 1707. And that's a longer process that we're not going to dive into today, but it is important to understand that when we look at Britain in the 1700s, the unification of the parliaments of Britain, of England and Scotland, and really the dissolution of both as independent nations, and now into a united kingdom, as the name would suggest, is really a very significant moment. So that can't be overstated, and the significance of that, well, certainly for Scotland, but also for Britain in general, is tremendous. So the British democracy and Britain and democracy in the 1700s is a really interesting topic because it is so varied. Britain, as we know, is very different from the rest of Europe, and Britain doesn't have the major revolution that other parts of Europe has. But there's also, it does not have the sort of absolutist situation that a lot of other parts of Europe has at the same time, right? So Britain does not have an absolute monarchy stretching all the way back to the 1200s. Britain does not have a entrenched, very powerful absolutist aristocracy. So it's a different situation. That being said, there are some institutions that Britain does maintain, right? The church is still very significant. You have the Anglican Church, which has 26 seats in the House of Lords, right, as peers. So it's important to understand that the situation, even though it's different, is similar in some ways, and then although similar in some ways, is very different in others. So as I said a moment ago, the really defining moment that is occurring here in the 1700s is the unification of the parliaments. And when the Scottish Parliament votes itself out of existence in May of in March of 1707, and then the unification that occurs on May 1st, 1707, is important. But also out of that, right, Scottish merchants become extremely extremely rich off of the unification, right? They now have access to the larger British Empire. So out of this, the Scottish merchants get massively rich, right, as they get access to the larger British Empire now, right, and they can now sell tobacco and other products within the empire. There's also a massive growing population, right? The Industrial Revolution gets kicked off in the British Isles at this time. So Scotland, Ireland, and obviously England, their populations increase exponentially. So that by the time we get to by the 1750s, 1800, and then into the late 1800s, this is looking at Scotland, right? The Scottish population grows substantially, but nonetheless, right, this creates massive urbanization and massive changes within the different parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland. So why is that, right? England, Scotland, Ireland have great natural resources. There are major coal reserves, iron reserves underneath the ground, right? There's massive banking industries, and there's just massive numbers of people and other items that are changing within the United Kingdom in the 1700s. So let's look now more specifically at democracy. I use the title here, So You Want a Revolution, alluding to the great Beatles song of the 1960s, as a pun, obviously. Anyway, so for Britain, right, one of the things that is very different here for the British compared, let's say, to their European counterparts is that the British do not have a lot of the other issues that the rest of rest of Europe has. The disaffection that exists in France, for instance, right? A massive debt, the entrenched aristocracy. Those things just don't exist in Britain. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily social mobility, but those things don't necessarily exist in Britain. Now, people within Britain certainly are disaffected, and they are certainly skeptical of the institutions that exist within Britain, but they are not revolting in the same way. And here's why. Number one, the British Empire is dominating the seas. The British government has a massive empire, right? Not just the 13 North American British colonies that ultimately become the United States. But after 1763, they have Canada. Before that, they have their Caribbean islands. They have, Jamaica, Barbados, British Guiana, and others. So the British government has a much different aspect in that respect. Also, because of the constitutional nature of the government, there are moderate liberties that people have. There's access to schools. In Scotland, there are 5 universities in the mid-1700s, and they have great numbers of students in them. So people have access to education. Now, that's less true, let's say, in a place like England, and certainly even more non-existent in a place like Ireland. But they do also have moderate liberties in terms of mobility. Again, there's no absolute aristocracy, so there is an ability for a wealthy merchant to own land and have a sort of better, stronger life. And taxation is relatively equitable. I wouldn't say that it's fair, certainly, but it's more equitable than it was in a place like France. Now, although Britain did have some things going for it in terms of not having a revolution in this period, there are certainly a couple of things that make it such that changes were going to need to happen. So land ownership within Britain was highly, highly concentrated. Now, it does not mean that it was non-existent among the lower classes, but it was certainly limited to the very wealthy, right? And there are these large landed estates, and that becomes more true after the Enclosure Act of 1773, which I'll get to in a second. That urbanization that is occurring because of the Industrial Revolution that I mentioned at the beginning of the video is also helping to consolidate cities' popularity. Cities are growing at vast numbers, but this doesn't mean that distribution of voting or distribution of representation is changing, right? So if we look at a place like London or Manchester or Liverpool or Glasgow or Edinburgh, those cities have massive new populations in the late 1700s into the early 1800s, but their representation is not changing such that those outer boroughs are keeping a representation that may have either moved away or died off. And the cities, even though they might be 3 times, 4 times, 5 times larger, don't have 3, 4, 5 more representatives. And that is exacerbated with the Enclosure Act of 1773. The Enclosure Act cuts off common people from the land on which they had historically and traditionally farmed, meaning that they had now lost a way to sustain themselves. That land now reverts to the larger landowner, the duke, the lord, or whoever, and the people now don't have a place to feed or clothe themselves, and as such, move elsewhere. By 1800, even though there are 9 million people within England, only about 10,000 families possess more than 1,500 pounds worth of land. So it's a very disproportionate wealth gap. There's a very lopsided economy. But even within that, right, even though there are great opportunities for education, newspapers and books are exceptionally expensive. Because of the Stamp Act, which gets so much ire in the American Revolution, books, newspapers are really, really expensive. Far more expensive than what people could afford in England. So access to education, even though access to education is high, access to reading material is low. And then within the House of Lords and in the House of Commons, you're talking about very small slivers of the population. The House of Lords has 300 members, and then there are 26 bishops within the Church of England that are represented. And then within the Commons, there are 558 members, but they are spread out all throughout the country. And again, those outside boroughs might indeed be overpopulated. Within Britain, one of the other reasons that there is not a massive revolution is that the clergy of, in a place like France, right, where the clergy takes an active role in supporting the revolution, in some cases, that was not true in places like Britain. So in Britain, the aristocracy of the church, the leadership of the church, the bishops of the church are members of the aristocracy, right? They hold seats in the House of Lords. The 26 bishops are all parts of the House of Lords. But even within that, right, the parsons or the priests that live out in the provinces, right, in the parishes, they are, the textbook calls it hobnobbing with the squires, right? So like even if they are out in the hinterlands, right, they are usually the most educated and probably the wealthiest member of the community. So they're not rubbing elbows with the poor, they're rubbing elbows with the rich. So their concerns are very narrow. Where in a place like France, right, those parish priests are out among the people, and they experience a lot of the same issues that the people are going to experience as well. The other part to this is that the British Empire is massively important for two reasons. Number one, the British government has the empire, and businessmen, the bourgeois, the people who are wealthy, right, even if they are not members of the aristocracy, they need the empire, right? If you are a cotton merchant, a linen merchant, a coal extractor, right, you need the empire to raise money for you. The empire is there for you to make money from. And if you have a revolution or get rid of the government, right, that empire will also go away. So it becomes exceptionally important for these business folk to keep the empire together. And as a result of that, there is a discouragement of revolution. You also have the issue where the people who are causing a lot of trouble find their way into the empire, right? If they are causing trouble at home, if they are causing trouble within communities, they are shipped away. So you have a release valve there where discontents, malcontents can be shipped away or voluntarily go away. Thomas Paine, although maybe not necessarily a discontent or a malcontent, he goes to North America, right? He comes to Philadelphia in the 1770s. Again, he then hobnobs and becomes friends with all of the Philadelphia elite, and obviously writes common sense that ultimately leads many people to support independence within the United States, what becomes the United States. But the opportunity of the empire cannot be overstated. The empire is extremely important in its ability to be that check valve, that release valve. There's also the prevalence of universities and colleges. Although these places do become, and clubs do become places that do foster conversation about the role of the empire, the people who are in there, some of them are revolutionary and do have different opinions about the role of the empire. They tend to be more conservative because, again, a lot of these people make money in the empire. And they give a place where people can be criticized, they can have discussions, but they tend to not be as revolutionary as one would expect. Finally, though, there are small changes that do come around. The income tax that William Pitt, the prime minister at the end of the 1700s, puts into place focuses on a different type of income. If you make less than £60 a year, you do not pay income tax. But if you make between 60 and 200, there's a progressive income tax that increases to 10% if you make more than £200 per year. For a person like Thomas Malthus, Malthus writes a book called The Essay on Population, where he discusses the issues of the rich versus the poor, and how the poor do not have opportunities that the rich do, and the sort of problem of income inequality and other items. So there are these small reforms that are made and these attentions that are being brought. Ultimately, looking ahead into the Victorian period, there is going to be something called the People's Charter that is mentioned in the textbook and sort of is foreshadowed at the end here. And there's going to be changes that are recommended for making the country more democratic. These rotten boroughs, these places that once were represented by maybe a member of parliament, and now because they had maybe a couple of hundred people, are going to continue and they're going to persist, such that by the 1800s and increased urbanization, you're talking about cities like Manchester, Liverpool, London, having hundreds of thousands of people, 300,000-400,000 people, but they're represented by the same number of people as a borough with, maybe a dozen people or 30 people or 100 people. So what happens here is these things still continue. And in the 1830s, there's a movement called the Chartist movement, named after the People's Charter, the British People's Charter. And it's going to push for electoral reform. And within Britain, right, the Industrial Revolution is going to do great things to increase this democratization. And it's going to increase the access of people to wealth as factories are established, as people get access to better paying jobs, middle class is going to grow. And all of these things are going to be true once the Industrial Revolution starts. And that's going to help create a situation whereby the British will not have a revolution in the same way that the French do, in the same way that the other parts of Europe do. Now, one final piece to that is Britain will, even though Britain does not have great democracy, and although Britain doesn't have the Great Revolution, Britain will be the great defender of conservatism within Europe in this period. They will fight against the French Revolution. They will send people into different places to prevent the increased democratization. And again, the reason for that is their institutions rely on access to the idea of aristocracy.